Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Well, den, Miss Sophia's run off. 'Deed she has. She run off in de night sometime, nobody don't know geez when. Run off to get married to dat young Harney Shepherdson, leastways so dey spec. De fambly found it out 'bout half an hour ago. Maybe a little mo. And I tell you dey warn't no time los. Sich another hurryin' up guns and hosses you never see. De women folks has gone for to stir up de relations. And ol' Mars Saul and de boys tuck dey guns and rode up de river road for to try to catch dat young man and kill him fo. He can get across de river wid Miss Sophia. I reckon dey's gwine to be mighty rough times. Buck went off 'thout waking me up. Well, I reckon he did. Dey warn't gwine to mix you up in it. Mars Buck, he loaded up his gun and load he's gwine to fetch home a Shepherdson or bust. Well, dey'll be plenty in 'em da, I reckon. And you bet you he'll fetch one ef he gets a chanced. I took up the river road as hard as I could put. By and by, I begin to hear guns a good ways off. When I come in sight of the log store and the woodpile where the steamboats lands, I worked along under the trees and brush till I got to a good place, and then I clumb up into the forks of a cottonwood that was out of reach and watched. There was a wood rank 4 foot high a little ways in front of the tree, and first I was going to hide behind that, but maybe it was luckier I didn't. There was 4 or 5 men cavorting around on their horses in the open place before the log store, cussing and yelling, and trying to get at a couple of young chaps that was behind the wood rank alongside of the steamboat landing. But they couldn't come it. Every time one of them showed himself on the river side of the woodpile, he got shot at. The 2 boys was squatting back to back behind the pile so they could watch both ways. By and by the men stopped cavorting around and yelling. They started riding towards the store. Then up gets one of the boys, draws a steady bead over the wood rank, and drops one of them out of his saddle. All the men jumped off of their horses and grabbed the hurt one and started to carry him to the store, and that minute the 2 boys started on the run. They got halfway to the tree I was in before the men noticed. Then the men see them and jumped on their horses and took out after them. They gained on the boys, but it didn't do no good. The boys had too good a start. They got to the woodpile that was in front of my tree and slipped in behind it, and so they had the bulge on the men again. One of the boys was Buck, and the other was a slim young chap about 19 years old. The men ripped around a while and then rode away. As soon as they was out of sight, I sung out to Buck and told him. He didn't know what to make of my voice coming out of the tree at first. He was awful surprised. He told me to watch out sharp and let him know when the men come in sight again. Said they was up to some devilment or other, wouldn't be gone long. I wished I was out of that tree, but I daren't come down. Buck begun to cry and rip, and lowed that him and his cousin Joe, that was the other young chap, would make up for this day yet. He said his father and his 2 brothers was killed, and 2 or 3 of the enemy. Said the Shepherdsons laid for them in ambush. Buck said his father and brothers ought to waited for their relations. The Shepherdsons was too strong for them. I asked him what was become of young Harney and Miss Sophia. He said they'd got across the river and was safe. I was glad of that. But the way Buck did take on because he didn't manage to kill Harney that day he shot at him, I hain't ever heard anything like it. All of a sudden, bang, 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 goes 3 or 4 guns. The men had slipped around through the woods and come in from behind without their horses. The boys jumped for the river. both of them hurt, and as they swum down the current, the men run along the bank shooting at them and singing out, "Kill them! Kill them!" It made me so sick I most fell out of the tree. I ain't a-going to tell all that happened. It would make me sick again if I was to do that. I wished I hadn't ever come ashore that night to see such things. I ain't ever going to get shut of them. Lots of times I dream about them that I stayed in the tree till it begun to get dark, afraid to come down. Sometimes I heard guns away off in the woods, and twice I seen little gangs of men gallop past the log store with guns. So I reckon the trouble was still a-going on. I was mighty downhearted. So I made up my mind I wouldn't ever go near that house again, because I reckoned I was to blame somehow. I judged that that piece of paper meant that Miss Sophia was to meet Harney somewheres at 2:30 and run off. And I judged I ought to told her father about that paper and the curious way she acted, and then maybe he would 'a' locked her up and this awful mess wouldn't ever happened. When I got down out of the tree, I crept along down the river bank a piece and found the two bodies laying in the edge of the water and tugged at them till I got them ashore. Then I covered up their faces and got away as quick as I could. I cried a little when I was covering up Buck's face, for he was mighty good to me that it was just dark now. I never went near the house, but struck through the woods and made for the swamp. Jim warn't on his island, so I tramped off in a hurry for the crick and crowded through the willows, red hot to jump aboard and get out of that awful country. The raft was gone, my souls, but I was scared. I couldn't get my breath for most a minute. Then I raised a yell. A voice not 25 foot from me says, "Good lawn, is dat you, honey? Don't make no noise." It was Jim's voice. Nothing ever sounded so good before. I run along the bank a piece and got aboard, and Jim he grabbed me and hugged me. He was so glad to see me. He says, "Laws bless you, Chilly. I usie right down show you's dead agin. Jack's been here. He say he reckon you's been shot, 'case you didn't come home no mo." So I's just this minute a-startin' to raft down towards de Moufford a crick, so's to be all ready for to shove out and leave soon as Jack comes agin and tells me for certain you is dead. Lawsy, I's mighty glad to get you back agin, honey. I says, "All right, that's mighty good. They won't find me, and they'll think I've been killed and floated down the river. There's something up there that'll help them think so. So don't you lose no time, Jim, but just shove off for the big water as fast as ever you can." I never felt easy till the raft was 2 miles below there and out in the middle of the Mississippi. Then we hung up our signal lantern and judged that we was free and safe once more. I hadn't had a bite to eat since yesterday, so Jim he got out some corn dodgers and buttermilk and pork and cabbage and greens. There ain't nothing in the world so good when it's cooked right, and whilst I eat my supper we talked and had a good time. I was powerful glad to get away from the feuds, and so was Jim to get away from the swamp. We said there warn't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft. 2 or 3 days and nights went by. I reckon I might say they swum by. They slid along so quiet and smooth and lovely. Here is the way we put in the time. It was a monstrous big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. We run nights and laid up and hid daytimes. Soon as night was most gone we stopped navigating and tied up, nearly always in the dead water under a towhead, and then cut young cottonwoods and willows and hid the raft with them. Then we set out the lines. Next we slid into the river and had a swim, so as to freshen up and cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom where the water was about knee-deep and watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywheres, perfectly still, just like the whole world was asleep, only sometimes the bullfrogs a-cluttering, maybe. The first thing to see, looking away over the water, was a kind of dull line. That was the woods on t'other side. You couldn't make nothing else out. Then a pale place in the sky, then more paleness spreading around. Then the river softened up a way off and weren't black anymore, but gray. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away, trading scows and such things, and long black streaks, rafts. Sometimes you could hear a sweep squeaking, or jumbled up voices. It was so still, and sounds come so far. And by you could see a streak on the water, which you know by the look of the streak that there's a snag there in a swift current which breaks on it and makes that streak look that way. And you see the mist curl up off of the water, and the east reddens up, and the river, and you make out a log cabin in the edge of the woods, away on the bank on t'other side of the river, being a woodyard likely, and piled by them cheats so you can throw a dog through it anywheres. Then the nice breeze springs up and comes fanning you from over there, so cool and fresh and sweet to smell on account of the woods and the flowers. But sometimes not that way, because they've left dead fish laying around, gars and such, and they do get pretty rank. And next you've got the full day and everything smiling in the sun, and the songbirds just going it. A little smoke couldn't be noticed now, so we would take some fish off of the lines and cook up a hot breakfast. And afterwards we would watch the lonesomeness of the river, and kind of lazy along, and by lazy off to sleep. Wake up by and look to see what done it, and maybe see a steamboat coughing along upstream. So far off towards the other side you couldn't tell nothing about her, only whether she was a stern wheel or side wheel. Then for about an hour there wouldn't be nothing to hear nor nothing to see, just solid lonesomeness. Next you'd see a raft sliding by, away off yonder, and maybe a galoot on it chopping, because they're most always doing it on a raft. You'd see the axe flash and come down, you don't hear nothing. You see that axe go up again, and by the time it's above the man's head then you hear the K-chunk. It had took all that time to come over the water. So we would put in the day, lazying around, listening to the stillness. Once there was a thick fog, and the rafts and things that went by was beating tin pans so the steamboats wouldn't run over them. A scow or a raft went by so close we could hear them talking and cussing and laughing. Heard them plain, but we couldn't see no sign of them. It made you feel crawly. It was like spirits carrying on that way in the air. Jim said he believed it was spirits, but I says, no, spirits wouldn't say. Durn the dern fog. Soon as it was night out we shoved. When we got her out to about the middle we let her alone, and let her float wherever the current wanted her to. Then we lit the pipes and dangled our legs in the water and talked about all kinds of things. We was always naked, day and night, whenever the mosquitoes would let us. The new clothes Buck's folks made for me was too good to be comfortable, and besides I didn't go much on clothes, nohow. Sometimes we'd have that whole river all to ourselves for the longest time. Yonder was the banks and the islands across the water, and maybe a spark which was a candle in a cabin window, and sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two on a raft or a scow, and maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming over from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there, all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them, and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim, he allowed they was made, but I allowed they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could 'a' laid them, Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it because I've seen a frog lay most as many, so of course it could be done. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, and see them streak down. Jim allowed they got spoiled and was hove out of the nest. Once or twice of a night we would see a steamboat slipping along in the dark, and now and then she would belch a whole world of sparks up out of her chimblies, and they would rain down in the river and look awful pretty. Then she would turn a corner and her lights would wink out and her powwow shut off and leave the river still again. And by her waves would get to us, a long time after she was gone, and joggle the raft a bit, and after that you wouldn't hear nothing for you couldn't tell how long, except maybe frogs or something. After midnight the people on shore went to bed, and then for 2 or 3 hours the shores was black, no more sparks in the cabin windows. These sparks was our clock. The first one that showed again meant morning was coming. So we hunted a place to hide and tie up right away. One morning about daybreak I found a canoe and crossed over a chute to the main shore. It was only 200 yards, and paddled about a mile up a creek amongst the cypress woods, to see if I couldn't get some berries. Just as I was passing a place where a kind of a cowpath crossed the creek, here comes a couple of men tearing up the path as tight as they could foot it. I thought I was a goner, for whenever anybody was after anybody I judged it was me, or maybe Jim. I was about to dig out from there in a hurry, but they was pretty close to me then, and sung out and begged me to save their lives. Said they hadn't been doing nothing and was being chased for it. Said there was men and dogs a-coming. They wanted to jump right in, but I says, "Don't you do it. I don't hear the dogs and horses yet. You've got time to crowd through the brush and get up the creek a little ways. Then you take to the water and wade down to me and get in. That'll throw the dogs off the scent." They done it, and soon as they was aboard I lit out for our towhead, and in about 5 or 10 minutes we heard the dogs and the men away off, shouting. We heard them come along towards the creek, but couldn't see them. They seemed to stop and fool around a while. Then, as we got further and further away all the time, we couldn't hardly hear them at all. By the time we had left a mile of woods behind us and struck the river, everything was quiet, and we paddled over to the towhead and hid in the cottonwoods and was safe. One of these fellows was about 70 or upwards, and had a bald head and very gray whiskers. He had an old battered-up slouch hat on, and a greasy blue woolen shirt, and ragged old blue jeans breeches stuffed into his boot tops, and home-knit galluses. No, he only had one. He had an old long-tailed blue jeans coat with slick brass buttons flung over his arm, and both of them had big, fat, ratty-looking carpet bags. The other fellow was about 30, and dressed about as ornery. After breakfast we all laid off and talked, and the first thing that come out was that these chaps didn't know one another. "What got you into trouble?" says the bald head to t'other chap. "Well, I'd been selling an article to take the tartar off the teeth, and it does take it off too, and generally the enamel along with it, but I stayed about 1 night longer than I ought to, and was just in the act of sliding out when I ran across you on the trail this side of town, and you told me they were coming, and begged me to help you to get off. So I told you I was expecting trouble myself, and would scatter out with you. That's the whole yarn. What's yourn?" Well, I'd been a-runnin' a little temperance revival thar, 'bout a week, and was the pet of the women folks, big and little, for I was making it mighty warm for the rummies, I tell you, and talking as much as $5 or $6 a night. 10 cents a head, children and niggers free, and business a-growin' all the time, when somehow or another a little report got around last night that I had a way of puttin' in my time with a private jug on the sly. A nigger rousted me out this mornin', and told me the people was gathering on the quiet with their dogs and horses, and they'd be along pretty soon and give me about half an hour's start, and then run me down if they could. And if they got me, they'd tar and feather me and ride me on a rail, sure. I didn't wait for no breakfast. I warn't hungry. Old man, said the young one, I reckon we might double-team it together. What do you think? I ain't undisposed. What's your line, mainly? Jour printer by trade. Do a little in patent medicines. Theater actor, tragedy, you know. Take a turn to mesmerism and phrenology when there's a chance. Teach singing geography school for a change. Sling a lecture sometimes. Oh, I do lots of things, most anything that comes handy, so it ain't work. What's your lay? I've done considerable in the doctoring way in my time. Layin' on a hands is my best holt, for cancer and paralysis and sich things, and I can tell a fortune pretty good when I've got somebody along to find out the facts for me. Preachin's my line, too, and workin' camp meetin's, and missionaryin' around. Nobody never said anything for a while. Then the young man hove a sigh and says, Alas! What you alassin about? Says the bald head. To think I should have lived to be leading such a life, and be degraded down into such company. And he begun to wipe the corner of his eye with a rag. Durn your skin, ain't the company good enough for you? Says the bald head, pretty pert and uppish. Yes, it is good enough for me. It's as good as I deserve. For who fetched me so low when I was so high? I did myself. I don't blame you, gentlemen. Far from it. I don't blame anybody. I deserve it all. Let the cold world do its worst. One thing I know, there's a grave somewhere for me. The world may go on just as it's always done, and take everything from me. Loved ones, property, everything. But it can't take that. Someday I'll lie down in it and forget it all, and my poor broken heart will be at rest. He went on a wiping. Draught your poor broken heart, says the bald head. What are you heaving your poor broken heart at us for? We hain't done nothing. No, I know you haven't. I ain't blaming you, gentlemen. I brought myself down. Yes, I did it myself. It's right I should suffer. Perfectly right. I don't make any moan. Brought you down from war? War was you brought down from. Ah, you would not believe me. The world never believes. Let it pass. 'Tis no matter. The secret of my birth. The secret of your birth. Do you mean to say, gentlemen, says the young man, very solemn, I will reveal it to you, for I feel I may have confidence in you. By rights I am a duke. Jim's eyes bugged out when he heard that, and I reckon mine did too. Then the bald head says, No, you can't mean it. Yes, my great-grandfather, eldest son of the Duke of Bridgewater, fled to this country about the end of the last century to breathe the pure air of freedom. Married here and died, leaving a son, his own father dying about the same time. The second son of the late Duke seized the titles and estates. The infant real Duke was ignored. I am the lineal descendant of that infant. I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater. And here am I, forlorn, torn from my high estate, hunted of men, despised by the cold world, ragged, worn, heartbroken, and degraded to the companionship of felons on a raft. Jim pitied him ever so much, and so did I. We tried to comfort him, but he said it warn't much use, he couldn't be much comforted. Said if we was a mind to acknowledge him, That would do him more good than most anything else. So we said we would if he would tell us how. He said we ought to bow when we spoke to him and say, Your Grace, or My Lord, or Your Lordship, and he wouldn't mind it if we called him plain Bridgewater, which, he said, was a title anyway and not a name, and one of us ought to wait on him at dinner and do any little thing for him he wanted done. Well, that was all easy, so we done it. All through dinner Jim stood around and waited on him and says, Will Yo Grace have some o' dis or some o' dat? And so on, and a body could see it was mighty pleasing to him. But the old man got pretty silent by and by, didn't have much to say, and didn't look pretty comfortable over all that petting that was going on around that Duke. He seemed to have something on his mind. So, along in the afternoon, he says, Looky here, Bilgewater, he says, I'm nation sorry for you, but you ain't the only person that's had troubles like that.
No.
No, you ain't. You ain't the only person that's been snaked down wrongfully out in a high place. Alas! No, you ain't the only person that's had a secret of his birth. And, by jings, he begins to cry. Hold! What do you mean? Bilgewater, can I trust you? Says the old man, still sort of sobbing. To the bitter death. He took the old man by the hand and squeezed it, and says, That secret of your being, speak, Bilgewater, I am the late Dauphin. You bet you, Jim, and me stared this time. Then the Duke says, You are what? Yes, my friend, it is too true. Your eyes is lookin' at this very moment on the poor disappeared Dauphin. Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI and Mary Antoinette. You, at your age. No, you mean you're the late Charlemagne. You must be 600 or 700 years old at the very least. Trouble has done it, Bilgewater, trouble has done it. Trouble has brung these gray hairs and this premature balditude. Yes, gentlemen, you see before you, in blue jeans and misery, the wanderin', exiled, trampled on, and sufferin' rightful king of France. Well, he cried and took on so that me and Jim didn't know hardly what to do. We was so sorry, and so glad and proud we'd got him with us, too. So we set in, like we done before with the Duke, and tried to comfort him. But he said it warn't no use, nothing but to be dead and done with it all could do him any good. Though he said it often made him feel easier and better for a while if people treated him according to his rights, and got down on one knee to speak to him and always called him Your Majesty, and waited on him first at meals and didn't set down in his presence till he asked them. So Jim and me set to majestying him and doing this and that and t'other for him, and standing up till he told us we might set down. This done him heaps of good, and so he got cheerful and comfortable. But the Duke kind of soured on him and didn't look a bit satisfied with the way things was going. Still, the king acted real friendly towards him and said the Duke's great-grandfather and all the other Dukes of Bilgewater was a good deal thought of by his father, and was allowed to come to the palace considerable. But the Duke stayed huffy a good while, till by and by the king says, Like as not we got to be together a blamed long time on this here raft, Bilgewater, and so what's the use o' your bein' sour? It'll only make things uncomfortable. It ain't my fault I warn't born a duke. It ain't your fault you warn't born a king. So what's the use to worry? Make the best o' things the way you find 'em, says I, that's my motto. This ain't no bad thing that we've struck here. Plenty grub and an easy life. Come, give us your hand, Duke, and le's all be friends. The Duke done it, and Jim and me was pretty glad to see it. It took away all the uncomfortableness and we felt mighty good over it, because it would have been a miserable business to have any unfriendliness on the raft. For what you want, above all things on a raft, is for everybody to be satisfied and feel right and kind towards the others. It didn't take me long to make up my mind that these liars weren't no kings nor dukes at all, but just low-down humbugs and frauds. But I never said nothing, never let on. Kept it to myself. It's the best way. Then you don't have no quarrels and don't get into no trouble. If they wanted us to call them kings and dukes, I hadn't no objections, long as it would keep peace in the family. And it warn't no use to tell Jim, so I didn't tell him. If I never learnt nothing else out of Pap, I learnt that the best way to get along with his kind of people is to let them have their own way. They asked us considerable many questions, wanted to know what we covered up the raft that way for, and laid by in the daytime instead of running. Was Jim a runaway nigger? Says I. Goodness sakes, would a runaway nigger run south? No, they allowed he wouldn't. I had to account for things some way, so I says, my folks was living in Pike County in Missouri where I was born, and they all died off but me and Pa and my brother Ike. Pa, he lowed he'd break up and go down and live with Uncle Ben, who's got a little one-horse place on the river, 44 mile below Orleans. Pa was pretty poor and had some debts. So when he'd squared up there warn't nothing left but $16 and our nigger, Jim. That warn't enough to take us 1,400 mile, deck passage nor no other way. Well, when the river rose, Pa had a streak of luck one day. He catched this piece of a raft, so we reckoned we'd go down to Orleans on it. Pa's luck didn't hold out. A steamboat run over the for'ard corner of the raft one night, and we all went overboard and dove under the wheel. Jim and me come up all right, but Pa was drunk and Ike was only 4 years old, so they never come up no more. Well, for the next day or two we had considerable trouble because people was always coming out in skiffs and trying to take Jim away from me, saying they believed he was a runaway nigger. We don't run daytimes no more now. Nights they don't bother us. The Duke says, leave me alone to cipher out a way so we can run in the daytime if we want to. I'll think the thing over. I'll invent a plan that'll fix it. We'll let it alone for today, because of course we don't want to go by that town yonder in daylight. It mightn't be healthy. Towards night it begun to darken up and look like rain. The heat lightning was squirting around low down in the sky, and the leaves was beginning to shiver. It was going to be pretty ugly, it was easy to see that. So the Duke and the King went to overhauling our wigwam to see what the beds was like. My bed was a straw tick better than Jim's, which was a corn shuck tick. There's always cobs around about in a shuck tick, and they poke into you and hurt, and when you roll over the dry shucks sound like you was rolling over in a pile of dead leaves. It makes such a rustling that you wake up. Well, the Duke allowed he would take my bed, but the King allowed he wouldn't. He says, I should 'a reckoned the difference in rank would 'a suggested to you that a corn shuck bed warn't just fittin' for me to sleep on. Your Grace'll take the shuck bed yourself. Jim and me was in a sweat again for a minute, being afraid there was going to be some more trouble amongst them. So we was pretty glad when the Duke says, 'Tis my fate to be always ground into the mire under the iron heel of oppression. Misfortune has broken my once haughty spirit. I yield, I submit. 'Tis my fate. I am alone in the world. Let me suffer. I can bear it. We got away as soon as it was good and dark. The King told us to stand well out towards the middle of the river and not show a light till we got a long ways below the town. We come in sight of the little bunch of lights by and by. That was the town, and slid by about a half a mile out, all right. When we was 3/4 of a mile below, we hoisted up our signal lantern. And about 10 o'clock it come on to rain and blow and thunder and lighten like everything. So the king told us to both stay on watch till the weather got better. Then him and the Duke crawled into the wigwam and turned in for the night. It was my watch below till 12, but I wouldn't have turned in anyway if I'd had a bed, because a body don't see such a storm as that every day in the week, not by a long sight. My souls, how the wind did scream along, and every second or two there'd come a glare that lit up the whitecaps for a half a mile around, and you'd see the islands looking dusty through the rain, and the trees thrashing around in the wind. Then comes a H-whack. Bum, bum, bumbalumbalum bum 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 bum, and the thunder would go rumbling and grumbling away and quit, and then rip comes another flash and another sockdolager. The waves most washed me off the raft sometimes, but I hadn't any clothes on and didn't mind. We didn't have no trouble about snags. The lightning was glaring and flittering around so constant that we could see them plenty soon enough to throw her head this way or that and miss them. I had the middle watch, but I was pretty sleepy by that time, so Jim he said he would stand the first half of it for me. He was always mighty good that way, Jim was. I crawled into the wigwam, but the king and the Duke had their legs sprawled around so there warn't no show for me. So I laid outside. I didn't mind the rain because it was warm and the waves weren't running so high now. About 2 they come up again, though, and Jim was going to call me. But he changed his mind because he reckoned they weren't high enough yet to do any harm. But he was mistaken about that, for pretty soon all of a sudden along comes a regular ripper and washed me overboard. It most killed Jim a laughing. He was the easiest nigger to laugh that ever was. Anyway that I took the watch, and Jim he laid down and snored away. And by the storm let up for good and all, and the first cabin light that showed, I rousted him out and we slid the raft into hiding quarters for the day. The king got out an old ratty deck of cards after breakfast, and him and the Duke played 7-up a while, 5 cents a game. Then they got tired of it and allowed they would lay out a campaign, as they called it. The Duke went down into his carpet bag and fetched up a lot of little printed bills and read them out loud. One bill said, "The celebrated Dr. Armand de Montalban of Paris would lecture on the science of phrenology at such and such a place on the blank day of blank at 10 cents admission and furnish charts of character at 25 cents apiece." The Duke said that was him. In another bill, he was the world-renowned Shakespearean tragedian, Garrick the Younger of Drury Lane, London. In other bills, he had a lot of other names and done other wonderful things, like finding water and gold with a divining rod, dissipating witch spells, and so on. By and by he says, "But the histrionic muse is the darling. Have you ever trod the boards? Royalty?" "No," says the king. "You shall then, before you're 3 days older, fall in grandeur," says the Duke. "The first good town we come to will hire a hall and do the sword fight in Richard III, and the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. How does that strike you? I'm in, up to the hub, for anything that will pay bilgewater. But you see, I don't know nothing about play actin', and hain't ever seen much of it. I was too small when Pap used to have 'em at the palace. Do you reckon you can learn me? Easy. All right, I'm just a-freezin' for something fresh. Anyway, le's commence right away." So the Duke he told him all about who Romeo was and who Juliet was, and said he was used to being Romeo, so the king could be Juliet. But if Juliet's such a young gal, Duke, my peeled head and my white whiskers is going to look uncommon odd on her, maybe. No, don't you worry. These country jakes won't ever think of that. Besides, you'll be in costume, and that makes all the difference in the world. Juliet's in a balcony, enjoying the moonlight before she goes to bed, and she's got on her nightgown and her ruffled nightcap. Here are the costumes for the parts. He got out 2 or 3 curtain calico suits, which he said was medieval armor for Richard III, and t'other chap, and a long white cotton nightshirt and a ruffled nightcap to match. The king was satisfied, so the Duke got out his book and read the parts over in the most splendid spread-eagle way, prancing around and acting at the same time, to show how it had got to be done. Then he gave the book to the king and told him to get his part by heart. There was a little one-horse town about 3 miles down the bend, and after dinner the Duke said he had ciphered out his idea about how to run in daylight without it being dangersome for Jim. So he allowed he would go down to the town and fix that thing. The king allowed he would go, too, and see if he couldn't strike something. We was out of coffee, so Jim said I better go along with them in the canoe and get some. When we got there warn't nobody stirring. Streets empty and perfectly dead and still like Sunday. We found a sick nigger sunning himself in a backyard, and he said everybody that warn't too young or too sick or too old was gone to camp meeting, about 2 mile back in the woods. The king got the directions and allowed he'd go and work that camp meeting for all it was worth, and I might go, too. The Duke said what he was after was a printing office. We found it. A little bit of a concern, up over a carpenter shop, carpenters and printers all gone to the meeting, and no doors locked. It was a dirty, littered-up place and had ink marks and handbills with pictures of horses and runaway niggers on them, all over the walls. The Duke shed his coat and said he was all right now. So me and the king lit out for the camp meeting. We got there in about a half an hour fairly dripping, for it was a most awful hot day. There was as much as 1,000 people there from 20 mile around. The woods was full of teams and wagons, hitched everywheres, feeding out of the wagon troughs and stomping to keep off the flies. There was sheds made out of poles and roofed over with branches, where they had lemonade and gingerbread to sell, and piles of watermelons and green corn and such like truck. The preaching was going on under the same kinds of sheds, only they was bigger and held crowds of people. The benches was made out of outside slabs of logs, with holes bored in the round side to drive sticks into for legs. They didn't have no backs. The preachers had high platforms to stand on at one end of the sheds. The women had on sunbonnets, and some had linsey-woolsey frocks, some gingham ones, and a few of the young ones had on calico. Some of the young men was barefooted, and some of the children didn't have on any clothes but just a tow linen shirt. Some of the old women was knitting, and some of the young folks was courting on the sly. The first shed we come to the preacher was lining out a hymn. He lined out 2 lines, everybody sung it, and it was kind of grand to hear it. There was so many of them, and they done it in such a rousing way. Then he lined out 2 more for them to sing, and so on. The people woke up more and more, and sung louder and louder. And towards the end some begun to groan, and some begun to shout. Then the preacher begun to preach, and begun in earnest too, and went weaving first to one side of the platform and then the other, and then leaning down over the front of it, with his arms and his body going all the time, and shouting his words out with all his might. And every now and then he would hold up his Bible and spread it open, and kind of pass it around this way and that, shouting, "It's the brazen serpent in the wilderness. Look upon it and live." And people would shout out, "Glory, Amen." And so he went on, and the people groaning and crying and saying Amen. "Oh, come to the mourner's bench. Come, black with sin. Amen. Come, sick and sore. Amen. Come, lame and halt and blind. Amen. Come, poor and needy, sunk in shame. Amen. Come, all that's worn and soiled and suffering. Come with a broken spirit. Come with a contrite heart. Come in your rags and sin and dirt. The waters that cleanse is free. The door of heaven stands open. Oh, enter in and be at rest. Amen. Glory, glory, hallelujah, and so on. You couldn't make out what the preacher said anymore on account of the shouting and crying. Folks got up everywheres in the crowd and worked their way just by main strength to the mourner's bench, with the tears running down their faces. And when all the mourners had got up there to the front benches in a crowd, they sung and shouted and flung themselves down on the straw, just crazy and wild. Well, the first I knowed the king got a-going, and you could hear him over everybody. And next he went a-charging up onto the platform, and the preacher he begged him to speak to the people, and he done it. He told them he was a pirate. Been a pirate for 30 years out in the Indian Ocean, and his crew was thinned out considerable last spring in a fight, and he was home now to take out some fresh men, and thanks to goodness he'd been robbed last night and put ashore off of a steamboat without a cent, and he was glad of it. It was the blessedest thing that ever happened to him, because he was a changed man now, and happy for the first time in his life. And poor as he was going to start right off and work his way back to the Indian Ocean and put in the rest of his life trying to turn the pirates into the true path. For he could do it better than anybody else, being acquainted with all pirate crews in that ocean. And though it would take him a long time to get there without money, he would get there anyway, and every time he convinced a pirate he would say to him, "Don't you thank me, don't you give me no credit. It all belongs to them dear people in Pokeville camp meeting, natural brothers and benefactors of the race. And that dear preacher there, the truest friend a pirate ever had." And then he busted into tears, and so did everybody. Then somebody sings out, "Take up a collection for him. Take up a collection." Well, a half a dozen made a jump to do it, but somebody sings out, "Let him pass the hat around." Then everybody said it, the preacher too. So the king went all through the crowd with his hat swabbing his eyes, and blessing the people and praising them and thanking them for being so good to the poor pirates away off there. And every little while the prettiest kind of girls, with the tears running down their cheeks, would up and ask him would he let them kiss him for to remember him by, and he always done it, and some of them he hugged and kissed as many as 5 or 6 times, and he was invited to stay a week, and everybody wanted him to live in their houses and said they'd think it was an honor. But he said as this was the last day of the camp meeting he couldn't do no good, and besides he was in a sweat to get to the Indian Ocean right off and go to work on the pirates. When we got back to the raft and he come to count up, he found he had collected $87.75. And then he had fetched away a 3-gallon jug of whiskey, too, that he found under a wagon when he was starting home through the woods. The king said, "Take it all around. It laid over any day he'd ever put in the missionarying line." He said it warn't no use talking. Heathens don't amount to shucks alongside of pirates to work a camp meeting with. The Duke was thinking he'd been doing pretty well till the king come to show up, but after that he didn't think so much. He had set up and printed off 2 little jobs for farmers in that printing office, horse bills, and took the money for dollars. And he had got in $10 worth of advertisements for the paper, which he said he would put in for $4 if they would pay in advance, so they done it. The price of the paper was $2 a year, but he took in 3 subscriptions for $50 apiece on condition of them paying him in advance. They were going to pay in cordwood and onions as usual, but he said he had just bought the concern and knocked down the price as low as he could afford it and was going to run it for cash. He set up a little piece of poetry, which he made himself out of his own head, 3 verses, kind of sweet and saddish. The name of it was, "Yes, Crush, Cold World, This Breaking Heart." And he left that all set up and ready to print in the paper and didn't charge nothing for it. Well, he took in $9.50 and said he'd done a pretty square day's work for it. Then he showed us another little job he'd printed and hadn't charged for because it was for us. It had a picture of a runaway nigger with a bundle on a stick over his shoulder and $200 reward under it. The reading was all about Jim and just described him to a dot. It said he run away from St. Jacques Plantation, 40 miles below New Orleans, last winter and likely went north, and whoever would catch him and send him back he could have the reward and expenses. "Now," says the Duke, "after tonight we can run in the daytime if we want to. Whenever we see anybody coming we can tie Jim hand and foot with a rope and lay him in the wigwam and show this handbill and say we captured him up the river, and we're too poor to travel on a steamboat, so we got this little raft on credit from our friends and are going down to get the reward. Handcuffs and chains would look still better on Jim, but it wouldn't go well with the story of us being so poor. Too much like jewelry. Ropes are the correct thing. We must preserve the unities, as we say on the boards." We all said the Duke was pretty smart, and there couldn't be no trouble about running daytimes. We judged we could make miles enough that night to get out of the reach of the powwow we reckoned the Duke's work in the printing office was going to make in that little town. Then we could boom right along if we wanted to. We laid low and kept still, and never shoved out till nearly 10 o'clock. Then we slid by, pretty wide away from the town, and didn't hoist our lantern till we was clear out of sight of it. When Jim called me to take the watch at 4 in the morning, he says, "Huck, does you reckon we gwine to run across any mo kings on dis trip?" "No," I says, "I reckon not." "Well," says he, "dat's all right den. I don't mind 1 or 2 kings, but dat's enough. Dis one's powerful drunk, and de Duke ein much better." I found Jim had been trying to get him to talk French so he could hear what it was like, but he said he had been in this country so long and had so much trouble he'd forgot it. It was after sunup now, but we went right on and didn't tie up. The king and the Duke turned out by and by looking pretty rusty, but after they jumped overboard and took a swim it chippered them up a good deal. After breakfast the king he took a seat on the corner of the raft and pulled off his boots and rolled up his breeches and let his legs dangle in the water so as to be comfortable and lit his pipe and went to getting his Romeo and Juliet by heart. When he had got it pretty good, him and the Duke begun to practice it together. The Duke had to learn him over and over again how to say every speech, and he made him sigh and put his hand on his heart, and after a while he said he done it pretty well. Only, he says, "You mustn't bellow out Romeo that way like a bull. You must say it soft and sick and languishy. So, Aro mio, that is the idea. For Juliet's a dear sweet mere child of a girl, and she doesn't bray like a jackass. Well, next they got out a couple of long swords that the Duke made out of oak laths, and begun to practice the sword fight. The Duke called himself Richard III, and the way they laid on and pranced around the raft was grand to see. But by and by the king tripped and fell overboard, and after that they took a rest and had a talk about all kinds of adventures they'd had in other times along the river. After dinner the Duke says, well, Capet will want to make this a first-class show, so I guess we'll add a little more to it. We want a little something to answer encores with, anyway. What's encores, Bilgewater? The Duke told him, and then says, I'll answer by doing the Highland Fling or the Sailor's Hornpipe. And you, well, let me see. Oh, I've got it. You can do Hamlet's soliloquy. Hamlet's which? Hamlet's soliloquy, the most celebrated thing in Shakespeare. Ah, it's sublime, sublime. Always fetches the house. I haven't got it in the book. I've only got one volume, but I reckon I can piece it out from memory. I'll just walk up and down a minute and see if I can call it back from recollection's vaults. So he went to marching up and down, thinking and frowning horrible every now and then. Then he would hoist up his eyebrows. Next he would squeeze his hand on his forehead and stagger back and kind of moan. Next he would sigh, and next he'd let on to drop a tear. It was beautiful to see him. By and by he got it. He told us to give attention. Then he strikes a most noble attitude, with one leg shoved forwards, and his arms stretched away up, and his head tilted back, looking up at the sky. And then he begins to rip and rave and grit his teeth. And after that, all through his speech, he howled and spread around and swelled up his chest and just knocked the spots out of any acting ever I see before. The first chance we got, the Duke he had some show bills printed. And after that, for 2 or 3 days as we floated along, the raft was a most uncommon lively place. For there warn't nothing but sword fighting and rehearsing, as the Duke called it, going on all the time. One morning, when we was pretty well down the state of Arkansas, we come in sight of a little one-horse town in a big bend. So we tied up about 3/4 of a mile above it, in the mouth of a creek which was shut in like a tunnel by the cypress trees, and all of us but Jim took the canoe and went down there to see if there was any chance in that place for our show. All the stores was along one street. They had white domestic awnings in front, and the country people hitched their horses to the awning posts. There was empty dry goods boxes under the awnings, and loafers roosting on them all day long, whittling them with their Barlow knives, and chawing tobacco and gaping and yawning and stretching. A mighty ornery lot. They generally had on yellow straw hats most as wide as an umbrella, but didn't wear no coats nor waistcoats. They called one another Bill and Buck and Hank and Joe and Andy, and talked lazy and drawly, and used considerable many cuss words. There was as many as one loafer leaning up against every awning post, and he most always had his hands in his breeches pockets, except when he fetched them out to lend a chaw of tobacco or scratch. What a body was hearing amongst them all the time was, "Gimme a chawvy tobaccer, Hank. Cain't. I hain't got but one chaw left. Ask Bill. Maybe Bill he gives him a chaw. Maybe he lies and says he ain't got none." Some of them kinds of loafers never has a cent in the world, nor a chaw of tobacco of their own. They get all their chawing by borrowing. They say to a fellow, "I wished you'd lend me a chaw, Jack. I just this minute give Ben Thompson the last chaw I had," which is a lie pretty much every time. It don't fool nobody but a stranger. But Jack ain't no stranger, so he says, "You give him a chaw, did you? So did your sister's cat's grandmother." You pay me back the chaws you've already borried off in me, Leif Buckner, then I'll loan you 1 or 2 ton of it, and won't charge you no back interest, nother. Well, I did pay you back some of it once. Yes, you did, 'bout 6 chaws. You borried store tobacco and paid back niggerhead. Store tobacco is flat black plug, but these fellows mostly chaws the natural leaf twisted. When they borrow a chaw, they don't generally cut it off with a knife, but set the plug in between their teeth, and gnaw with their teeth and tug at the plug with their hands till they get it in too. Then sometimes the one that owns the tobacco looks mournful at it when it's handed back and says, sarcastic, "Here, gimme the chaw and you take the plug. All the streets and lanes was just mud. They warn't nothing else but mud. Mud as black as tar and nigh about a foot deep in some places, and 2 or 3 inches deep in all the places. The hogs loafed and grunted around everywheres. You'd see a muddy sow and a litter of pigs come lazying along the street and hollop herself right down in the way, where folks had to walk around her, and she'd stretch out and shut her eyes and wave her ears whilst the pigs was milking her, and look as happy as if she was on salary. And pretty soon you'd hear a loafer sing out, 'Hi! So boy! Sick him tige!' And away the sow would go, squealing most horrible, with a dog or 2 swinging to each ear, and 3 or 4 dozen more a-coming. And then you would see all the loafers get up and watch the thing out of sight, and laugh at the fun and look grateful for the noise. Then they'd settle back again till there was a dog fight. There couldn't anything wake them up all over and make them happy all over like a dog fight, unless it might be putting turpentine on a stray dog and setting fire to him, or tying a tin pan to his tail and see him run himself to death. On the river front some of the houses was sticking out over the bank, and they was bowed and bent and about ready to tumble in. The people had moved out of them. The bank was caved away under one corner of some others, and that corner was hanging over. People lived in them yet, but it was dangersome, because sometimes a strip of land as wide as a house caves in at a time. Sometimes a belt of land 1/4 of a mile deep will start in and cave along till it all caves into the river in one summer. Such a town as that has to be always moving back and back and back, because the river's always gnawing at it. The nearer it got to noon that day, the thicker and thicker was the wagons and horses in the streets, and more coming all the time. Families fetched their dinners with them from the country and eat them in the wagons. There was considerable whiskey drinking going on, and I seen 3 fights. By and by somebody sings out, "Here comes old Boggs," in from the country for his little old monthly drunk. "Here he comes, boys." All the loafers looked glad. I reckon they was used to having fun out of Boggs. One of them says, "Wonder who he's a-gwine to chaw up this time. If he'd a-chawed up all the men he's been a-gwine to chaw up in the last 20 year, he'd have considerable reputation now." Another one says, "I wished old Boggs d threaten me, 'cause then I'd know I warn't gwine to die for 1,000 year." Boggs comes a-tearing along on his horse, whooping and yelling like an Injun, and singing out, "Clear the track thar, I'm on the Vav path, and the price UV coffins is a-gwine to raise." He was drunk and weaving about in his saddle. He was over 50-year-old and had a very red face. Everybody yelled at him and laughed at him and sassed him, and he sassed back and said he'd attend to them and lay them out in their regular turns. But he couldn't wait now because he'd come to town to kill old Colonel Sherburne, and his motto was, "Meat first and spoon victuals to top off on." He see me and rode up and says, "Ward you come FM, boy? You prepared to die." Then he rode on. I was scared, but a man says, "He don't mean nothing. He's always a carryin' on like that when he's drunk. He's the best naturedest old fool in Arkansas. Never hurt nobody, drunk nor sober." Boggs rode up before the biggest store in town and bent his head down so he could see under the curtain of the awning and yells, "Come out here, Sherburne. Come out and meet the man you've swindled. You're the hound I'm after, and I'm a-gwine to have you too." And so he went on, calling Sherburne everything he could lay his tongue to, and the whole street packed with people listening and laughing and going on. By and by, a proud-looking man about 55, and he was a heap the best-dressed man in that town, too, steps out of the store, and the crowd drops back on each side to let him come. He says to Boggs, mighty Sam and slow, he says, "I'm tired of this, but I'll endure it till 1 o'clock. Till 1 o'clock, mind, no longer. If you open your mouth against me only once after that time, you can't travel so far, but I will find you." Then he turns and goes in. The crowd looked mighty sober. Nobody stirred, and there warn't no more laughing. Boggs rode off blackguarding Sherburne as loud as he could yell, all down the street, and pretty soon back he comes and stops before the store, still keeping it up. Some men crowded around him and tried to get him to shut up, but he wouldn't. They told him it would be 1 o'clock in about 15 minutes, and so he must go home. He must go right away. But it didn't do no good. He cussed away with all his might, and throwed his hat down in the mud and rode over it, and pretty soon away he went a-raging down the street again, with his gray hair a-flying. Everybody that could get a chance at him tried their best to coax him off of his horse so they could lock him up and get him sober, but it warn't no use. Up the street he would tear again and give Sherburne another cussing. By and by somebody says, "Go for his daughter. Quick, go for his daughter. Sometimes he'll listen to her. If anybody can persuade him, she can." So somebody started on a run. I walked down street a ways and stopped. In about 5 or 10 minutes here comes Boggs again, but not on his horse. He was a-reeling across the street towards me, bareheaded, with a friend on both sides of him a-holt of his arms and hurrying him along. He was quiet and looked uneasy, and he warn't hanging back any, but was doing some of the hurrying himself. Somebody sings out, "Boggs!" I looked over there to see who said it, and it was that Colonel Sherburne. He was standing perfectly still in the street, and had a pistol raised in his right hand, not aiming it, but holding it out with the barrel tilted up towards the sky. The same second I see a young girl coming on the run, and 2 men with her. Boggs and the men turned round to see who called him, and when they see the pistol the men jump to one side, and the pistol barrel come down slow and steady to a level, both barrels cocked. Boggs throws up both of his hands and says, "Oh Lord, don't shoot." Bang! Goes the first shot and he staggers back, clawing at the air. Bang! Goes the second one, and he tumbles backwards onto the ground, heavy and solid, with his arms spread out. That young girl screamed out and comes rushing, and down she throws herself on her father, crying and saying, "Oh, he's killed him, he's killed him." The crowd closed up around them and shouldered and jammed one another, with their necks stretched, trying to see, and people on the inside trying to shove them back and shouting, "Back, back, give him air, give him air." Colonel Sherburne, he tossed his pistol onto the ground and turned around on his heels and walked off. They took Boggs to a little drugstore, the crowd pressing around just the same, and the whole town following, and I rushed and got a good place at the window where I was close to him and could see in. They laid him on the floor and put one large Bible under his head, and opened another one and spread it on his breast. But they tore open his shirt first, and I seen where one of the bullets went in. He made about a dozen long gasps, his breast lifting the Bible up when he drawed in his breath, and letting it down again when he breathed it out, and after that he laid still. He was dead. Then they pulled his daughter away from him, screaming and crying, and took her off. She was about 16 and very sweet and gentle looking, but awful pale and scared. Well, pretty soon the whole town was there, squirming and scrooging and pushing and shoving to get at the window and have a look, but people that had the places wouldn't give them up, and folks behind them was saying all the time, "Say now, you've looked enough, you fellows. 'Tain't right and 'tain't fair for you to stay there all the time and never give nobody a chance. Other folks has their rights as well as you." There was considerable jawing back, so I slid out, thinking maybe there was going to be trouble. The streets was full, and everybody was excited. Everybody that seen the shooting was telling how it happened, and there was a big crowd packed around each one of these fellows, stretching their necks and listening. One long, lanky man with long hair and a big white fur stovepipe hat on the back of his head, and a crooked-handled cane, marked out the places on the ground where Boggs stood and where Sherburne stood, and the people following him around from one place to t'other and watching everything he done, and bobbing their heads to show they understood, and stooping a little and resting their hands on their thighs to watch him mark the places on the ground with his cane. And then he stood up straight and stiff where Sherburne had stood, frowning and having his hat brimmed down over his eyes, and sung out, "Boggs!" and then fetched his cane down slow to a level and says, "Bang!" Staggered backwards, says, "Bang!" again, and fell down flat on his back. The people that had seen the thing said he done it perfect. Said it was just exactly the way it all happened. Then as much as a dozen people got out their bottles and treated him.